Pate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honourable Senators, I move that this bill be read a second time.
It is moved by the Honourable Senator Pate, seconded by the Honourable Senator Milleville-Deschênes, that this bill be read a second time. On debate.
Thank you. I rise today on the unceded, unsurrendered, and unreturned territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe as I reintroduce Tona's Law. The purpose of Tona's Law is to ensure oversight, remedies, and alternatives to isolation in federal prisons. Speaking about human rights today feels somewhat precarious. We teeter from unredressed colonial legacies to attacks on the sovereignty of Canada. Too many are facing horrendous barriers to securing food and shelter and health care, as well as threats that the notwithstanding clause will be used to condone squashing human and charter rights and securing draconian punishments. Prisons are full of the people who are failed by every other system: health, social, child welfare, education, income, and income supports. Those most marginalized in Canada, those who are poor, homeless, living with mental health and addiction issues, are being subjected to unthinkable, inhumane conditions in federal prisons. The erosion and trampling of human rights in our prisons reflects our wholly inadequate protection of our fundamental values. In societies where rights and freedoms are taken away, those most marginalized are always the first victims. But the abuse never stops there. With elbows up, it is time to push back on the normalization of inequality, marginalization, and oppression wherever it occurs. Tona's Law deals with isolation, also known as solitary confinement, and segregation. How can I capture the horror of caging and isolating humans in little more than a concrete closet for hours, days, weeks, and even years on end? If you have witnessed, read the court cases, medical findings, or coroner's inquests on the impact of isolation on the minds and bodies of those who have survived it, you already know that the harms begin the minute the cell doors clang shut. Within 48 hours, sensory deprivation and other irreversible harms can take root. After 7 days of isolation, brain activity can be permanently altered. As summarized by the Ontario Court of Appeal, isolation is, quote, repeatedly linked to appetite and sleep problems, anxiety, panic, rage, loss of control, depersonalization, paranoia, hallucinations, self-mutilation, increased rates of suicide, and self-harm, end quote. 15 days in isolation is considered internationally as amounting to torture. Isolation is too often the default means of responding to prisoners whose complex needs relating to age, disability, mental health, addiction, trauma, the intergenerational impact of colonialism. We have failed. As calculated by the parliamentary budget officers, Canadians pay millions upon millions each year on isolation, one of the most cruel, ineffective, and expensive approaches to our shared goal of improving public safety. For nearly 5 decades, I have spent countless hours kneeling on cement floors, at little slots, or at door hinges, pleading with people, with someone's children, siblings, parents, or partners, be it to stop smashing their heads, slashing their bodies, tying ligatures around their necks, trying to gouge their own eyes out, or otherwise mutilate themselves. The sounds of torment and despair are indescribable. They will forever haunt me, and how can any of us even imagine so craving human contact that we risk death in order to instigate even a violent human intervention? In 2019, the government promised that Bill C-83 would eliminate the use of segregation and solitary confinement in federal penitentiaries. Instead, the legislation was aimed at preventing the Supreme Court of Canada from upholding Provincial Court of Appeal decisions, ruling that segregation and solitary confinement are harmful and unconstitutional. More than 5 years later, isolation is used more often and with less oversight. The Senate has repeatedly recognized the need to safeguard the human and charter rights that protect federal prisoners and all Canadians. Colleagues, we have already voted 3 times in favor of the measures in Tona's Law. In 2019, the Senate voted to add these measures to Bill C-83 at the recommendation of the Senate Social Affairs Committee. They were short-sightedly removed by the government. In 2021, this chamber endorsed these measures as part of the recommendations of the Human Rights Committee in its report on the human rights of federally sentenced persons. Most recently, in December 2024, following robust and multi-year consideration by the Legal Committee, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and this chamber, Tona's Law was passed and sent to the other place. The bill before us today is the same one we passed. One lone edit was made to clarify in the text of the bill a point that we had understood in practice when passing the bill, that the term disabling mental health issues in Tona's Law could be defined using criteria already appearing elsewhere and endorsed by the government in the Corrections and Conditional Release Act. The election and new Parliament put us back to square one, with years of work at risk of being wiped out. This would be a particularly cruel outcome for those trapped in isolation, souls for whom every day counts. As I humbly urge that we vote to send this bill back to the House of Commons as soon as possible, I thank colleagues for your continued encouragement and support. Allow me here to give a shout out to the collective work of the more than 40 of you who have gone to prisons to meet with those trapped inside as part of the Senators Go to Jail initiative. Back in 2019, within moments of Bill C-83 passing, a number of you, including the sponsor of the government bill in the Senate, proposed that senators work together to visit prisons in order to monitor implementation of Bill C-83, and particularly its human rights impacts. I thank all of you who have supported and participated in this initiative. I'm also grateful for the inspiration of Tona Mills. Tona implored the members of the Human Rights Committee to do whatever we could to prevent anyone else from experiencing the horrendous conditions to which she has been subjected, and which resulted in her eventual psychiatric diagnosis of isolation-induced schizophrenia. She urged us to end solitary confinement and get others out of prisons and into appropriate mental health services. I first met Tona 3 decades ago. I knelt at meal slots at her segregation cells, first at the Prison for Women in Kingston and later in other prisons, including segregated units in prisons for men, as Tona spent nearly every hour of every day for more than 10 years in solitary confinement, sometimes also shackled to beds or floors. Outside the now closed Prison for Women, Tona's cell-sized metal recreation cage still stands. Visiting the site with law students in recent years, one of them asked me if that was where they kept the dogs. You can imagine their horror when I explained that it was constructed to contain Tona for her 1 hour of fresh air when she received it. Tona today is in the palliative stages of terminal cancer. Her community of caregivers is incredulous at the notion that she could ever have been described as dangerous. They experience her as a witty, kind, and generous patient who takes every opportunity to advocate for others. Since December, when we passed the last iteration of Tona's Law, the need for this law has only increased. In their final act before being disbanded, the independent panel of experts appointed by the Minister of Public Safety to monitor implementation of Bill C-83 delivered its final report. The panel concluded that in the structured intervention unit system created by Bill C-83, I quote, "The practice of solitary confinement continues, and oversight of the practice, as highlighted by recent court decisions, is virtually non-existent." The panel underscored that SIUs are located in what were once called segregation cells, sometimes under a thin coat of paint. According to the panel, most of those in SIUs continue to experience the conditions of solitary confinement. For the significant proportion whose solitary confinement lasts longer than 15 days, I quote, "The Mandela rules suggest that these prisoners are experiencing conditions amounting to torture or other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment," end quote. The panel emphasized the lack of effective oversight of the SIUs. This reality notwithstanding, Corrections repeatedly points to the existence of 3 SIU oversight bodies: the Ministerial Advisory Panel itself, the Office of the Correctional Investigator, and independent external decision makers. Yet Corrections consistently fails to respond to or recognize the concerns that these bodies raise when they do. This already unacceptable situation only became worse with the disbanding of the Ministerial Advisory Panel. Despite their name, the work of independent external decision-makers depends on corrections, the agency whose decisions they review. It is corrections that flags to IEDMs which prisoners may be at risk as a result of correctional decisions. Despite IEDMs describing themselves as overloaded, last year the Minister of Public Safety decided not to renew contracts of several IEDMs. For months, only 7 of 12 positions were staffed, until more appointments were made late this spring. Those IEDMs whose contracts were not renewed were also those who were least likely to rubber stamp correctional decisions. The Ministerial Advisory Panel urged that the government must, quote, demonstrate it is serious about ensuring correctional operations are lawful and charter compliant. It must demonstrate that it understands that this requires ongoing and focused oversight of isolating conditions of confinement, end quote. The previous Minister of Public Safety repeatedly refused to appear before the Senate Human Rights Committee to discuss these and other concerns about human rights of prisoners. What is more, the government has so far failed to ensure completion of the requisite 5-year parliamentary review of SIUs and Bill C-83. The Ministerial Advisory Panel emphasized that those most marginalized, particularly Black and Indigenous peoples, and those with disabling mental health issues, are most likely to be isolated in SIUs. International and Canadian legal standards prohibit solitary confinement of those with disabling mental health issues. Yet Corrections' own data reveals the rates of those with mental health issues are double in SIUs. Black Canadians account for 4% of the Canadian population, 10% of those in federal prisons, and 18% of those in SIUs. Indigenous peoples are 5% of the Canadian population, 33% of those in federal prisons, and 44% of those in SIUs. Almost all, 96% of women in SIUs are Indigenous. It is indeed striking and disturbing that Ministerial Advisory Panel members reported visiting an SIU where an Indigenous elder working with prisoners, quote, specifically mentioned that SIUs reflect the worst of corrections. There is no treatment, no help, no hope. The oversight mandate of the defunct Ministerial Advisory Panel and IEDMs focuses only on SIUs, leaving every other form of isolation to operate without any oversight at all. Members of the Ministerial Advisory Panel reported their concern about non-SIU isolation, such as, quote, an entire unit housing prisoners in what can only be described as solitary confinement. They were all extremely concerned that within SIUs they found at times there were more prisoners physically in the SIU than showed up on official records of the SIU count on the day that they visited. The final report of the Ministerial Advisory Panel highlights that SIUs are, quote, arguably the most surveilled spaces in Canadian penitentiary. Yet, with extremely limited oversight, conditions in those units too often amount to torture. If the conditions in SIUs are considered torture, this practice of abuse in plain sight should make us more urgently concerned about what is happening in other areas of isolation in prisons, since they are subject to no surveillance. The few cases that make the news give us some sense of the culture of human rights abuses in Canadian prisons. In March, a judge issued a final report in a fatality inquiry regarding the death of a young Indigenous prisoner, Mason Montgrand, at the Edmonton Institution, a federal penitentiary. 21-year-old Mason died in 2011 after guards let him and another prison with a rival gang affiliation out of their cells at the same time. His death was examined as part of a police investigation into a fight club at the prison. Allegations that prison staff were forcing prisoners in their custody to fight each other, resulting in serious injuries and death. Police strongly recommended charging 2 correctional officers and a correctional manager with murder and criminal negligence, but prosecutors declined to lay charges. Nearly a decade and a half later, the judge presiding over the fatality inquiry explained that there was still little transparency from authorities about what happened to Mr. Montgrand, and that information was repeatedly withheld from her. she called for a public inquiry to provide further clarity into what she termed a matter of public concern. Around the same time, the Toronto Star published a video of guards committing mass human rights abuses against 200 men at Maplehurst Provincial Prison in Ontario. The video shows the jail superintendent responding with congratulatory fist bumps for the abusive staff. The retaliatory mass punishment was apparently the staff response to one prisoner allegedly punching a guard on December 20th, 2023. 2 days later, the superintendent decided to deploy guards trained to respond to riots on quiet, unsuspecting men locked in their cells. Guards strip-searched the men, used their thumbs like joysticks to lead them out of cells, breaking at least one man's thumb and another's wrist, forcing them to sit facing the wall in their underwear with weapons trained at their heads. The men were then confined to empty cells as prison authorities blasted cold air onto the range. They were finally provided with clothes on Christmas Eve. As many as 80% of the men who were abused at Maplehurst were awaiting trials and had not been convicted of a criminal offense. The Toronto Star has confirmed at least 11 cases where sentences were reduced and one where charges were stayed altogether, noting that in total more than 100 cases could be affected. A Crown attorney in one such case told the court that he agreed to a plea deal for no additional jail time beyond time already served because while he would have undeniably sought a significantly higher sentence, there was no escaping the violation by the jail. Through Tona's law, the federal government could lead by example, making clear that the accountability that Canadians rightly expect from criminal, legal, and prison systems must flow from and be modeled by the behaviors of those in positions of authority, especially when it comes to the custody and lives of others. So little has changed since the all too familiar certain events at the Prison for Women in Kingston 31 years ago. After being isolated in segregation and denied access to food, water, clothing, and calls to lawyers, on April 26, 1994, an all-male emergency riot squad dragged sleeping women out of their cells to be unlawfully stripped, shackled, and left in segregation cells naked save for flimsy paper gowns tied around their necks. The majority of those women were Indigenous. Today, the violation of these women's charter and human rights is recognized as a travesty and a massive arbitrary display of masculine force exercised in the face of virtually no resistance. When I became the first non-corrections or prison-related person to meet with the women after these events, prison officials advised me that I was misinformed about what had happened. I was counseled, cajoled, and then cautioned against being so easily conned. The pressure to recant intensified, and my integrity and employment were repeatedly threatened over the ensuing year, until the eventual airing of the video of those events by the Fifth Estate. The videos proved every allegation by the women, and by extension me, to be true. The travesties inside prisons that we hear about are often characterized by correctional authorities as anomalous or exaggerated. Horrifically, they are not. Because of the closed nature of prisons, most abuses are never revealed to the public. Cultures of systemic human rights violations and oppression are rarely revealed to those of us outside prison walls. Too few have information about what is going on in Canadian prisons. Even fewer are believed if they try to speak out. As many of you know firsthand, even judges and parliamentarians struggle to get answers from those responsible for prisons. Abuse is enabled precisely because of the lack of effective oversight, transparency, and accountability. So what would Tona's law change? First, it would finally implement the court oversight of decisions to isolate prisoners that Louise Arbour recommended nearly 3 decades ago, following her work presiding over the Commission of Inquiry in response to the events at the Prison for Women in Kingston. Tona's law would require prison authorities to seek approval of a superior court to keep a person in isolation for more than 48 hours. This cap reflects the latest data acknowledged by the Ontario Court of Appeal, among others, about when irreparable physical, psychological, and neurological harms can begin. Second, if correctional mismanagement has made a person's sentence more punitive, for example, due to extensive periods of time in isolation, that person can apply to the court that sentenced them for a reduced sentence or parole ineligibility period. Currently, if abuse occurs before a sentence is issued, as I've already mentioned about Maplehurst, the criminal code permits judges to reduce the length of sentence in response. In the Hills decision in 2023, the Supreme Court of Canada reminded judges that when they order a sentence, they also need to look ahead to what a person will experience in prison, including how factors such as Indigenous status, race, mental and physical health can result in harsher and more punitive conditions. But what about conditions of isolation that a judge did not foresee? As recommended by Louise Arbour, Tona's law would fill this gap. It would allow sentences to be adjusted as a remedy when rights are violated in prison. This kind of remedy exists in several northern and western European countries, as well as in our youth system. Third, because isolation also occurs outside SIUs, Tona's law would ensure that court oversight and any other applicable safeguards extend to all conditions of isolation, anytime a person is in conditions more restrictive than the general population. When the Senate voted to pass the last iteration of Tona's law, it did so on the strength of witness testimony in support of court oversight from experts including the Canadian Prison Law Association, BC Civil Liberties Association, John Howard Society of Canada, Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, Criminal Lawyers Association, the West Coast Prison Justice Society, Native Women's Association, the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers, the Mental Health Commission of Canada, Dr. Adelina Iftana, lawyer Michael Spratt, and Professor Emeritus and prison law expert Michael Jackson. Professor Jackson concluded, after half a century of working on non-judicial oversight, that involving the courts is the only way to remedy this wrong. He stated, and I quote, "Correctional Service of Canada has fiercely resisted any independent adjudication of segregation. In light of the collective experiences, almost 50 years of reports in which CSC has expressed its resistance, at this point, judicial review is the appropriate remedial measure," end quote. Addressing concerns about the capacity of courts to handle a large number of applications, criminal law expert Michael Spratt noted that courts will rise to the challenge, as they do for mechanisms like bail reviews that involve high volume and time-sensitive applications as part of safeguarding charter rights. He added that the requirement to apply to court after 48 hours of isolation itself will help to deter corrections from unnecessarily keeping people in isolation. Tona's law can save resources as well as lives. As acknowledged by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, fewer people in SIUs will save hundreds of thousands of dollars per person per year. Furthermore, the government has paid tens of millions of dollars in damages to those whose rights were violated by its former segregation system and is now facing similar class action challenges to its 2019 SIU regime. In recent months, the Supreme Court of Canada called out unconstitutional punitive uses of solitary confinement in provincial prisons, a situation that could have been prevented with federal leadership and a provincial version of Tona's law. In another case, the court emphasized that the state may be liable for charter damages if Parliament passes legislation that is clearly unconstitutional. As we debated Bill C-83 in 2019, experts warned us that the legislation was not charter compliant. The analysis of government data by the minister's own advisory panel has since confirmed that unconstitutional solitary confinement persists. In placing limitations on the use of isolation in federal prisons, Tona's law also proposes crucial alternatives for the most at risk of being placed in SIUs. For those with disabling mental health issues, Tona's law could expand existing provisions authorizing corrections to transfer prisoners to provincial territorial health systems, including for mental health reasons. Notably, the bill would add a requirement to transfer those found to have a disabling mental health issue. As noted, explicit reference is included in Tona's law to specify that it is precisely the same criteria established in the Corrections and Conditional Release Act provisions on SIUs at Section 37.11 that would be used to help determine whether a disabling mental health issue exists. While opportunities to transfer people out of prison have long existed, they have been too rarely used to address mental health issues. Despite much evidence that corrections-based services often defer to security systems, Even in the case where therapeutic needs are identified as a priority, Corrections continues to invest resources with the explicit intention of ostensibly providing mental health treatment and then failing to do so within prisons. When we passed this bill in December, I spoke about an Ontario Superior Court case involving Mr. Warren, whose disabling mental health issues led to a series of arson convictions and a dangerous offender designation. Justice Pomerantz referenced Tona's law and ordered that Mr. Warren serve his sentence in a hospital. Mr. Warren faced an indeterminate sentence, and Justice Pomerantz recognized that in prison he would be condemned to lifelong isolation, with no hope of adequate treatment or any chance of working toward community integration. She ruled that incarceration would violate his charter rights. In the year since this court decision, Mr. Warren, like too many others, has languished in conditions of isolation at Millhaven Prison in Kingston. In the meantime, as the government appeals Justice Pomerantz's decision, Corrections is effectively defying the order by contacting provincially run forensic hospitals, asking if they have space for a person with a dangerous offender designation and offering no resources to support his treatment. Such transparently irresponsible attempts to undermine Justice Pomerantz's direction are both reprehensible and unfortunately predictable. Meanwhile, we must also examine what Corrections has done with the resources it was allocated to contract mental health beds with provinces. In connection with Bill C-83, CSC was provided with at least $74 million tax dollars per year to address the mental health needs of prisoners. Corrections testified to the Social Affairs Committee and the Human Rights Committee that some of this funding, at one point they suggested $9.2 million, was earmarked for contracting access to the very external mental health beds that Mr. Warren and so many others so urgently need. Yet no new beds were in fact contracted by CSC, and it has provided inconsistent and misleading responses to requests for information about what they did with this money. Tona's law would push CSC to adequately fund and support community-based mental health services. This would not only be more humane and effective for prisoners, but it would also save lives and money. Data from the Parliamentary Budget Office suggests that due to the tremendous costs of isolation, paying for a bed in a forensic hospital would actually represent savings of around $100,000 per year per person. By ensuring people get adequate treatment, these types of measures would also help improve the mental health status of so many and reduce strain on the mental health system long term. In the absence of Tona's law, Corrections is doubling down on costly and ineffective approaches to mental health. Just days after this chamber passed Tona's law, Corrections announced that it would not follow the direction of courts and countless experts on mental health and accountability. Instead, CSC plans to build what it calls a health center of excellence at the prison where staff were charged with manslaughter related to the death of a man with mental health issues following, quote, multiple uses of unnecessary and inappropriate physical and chemical force. Tona's law would also breathe life into existing alternatives to isolation for Indigenous peoples and other marginalized groups, recognizing that as a result of systemic discrimination and colonialism, Indigenous women and others most in need of community support and connection too often end up incarcerated, labeled as risks, and locked away alone in SIUs. Tona's law seeks to expand access to Sections 81 and 84 of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, which permit prisoners to be transferred and released to the care and custody of Indigenous communities. Those repeatedly calling for this aspect of Tona's law include commission after commission, whether the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Native Women's Association of Canada, 2 House of Commons committees, the Office of the Correctional Investigator, and the Canadian Human Rights Commission. Tona's law also aims to expand use of these provisions, in particular by allowing corrections to enter agreements for community-based care and custody with additional kinds of community groups serving others who are overrepresented in federal prisons as a result of systemic inequality. For example, Black Canadians and 2S LGBTQI+ folks. When the Senate made the amendments to Bill C-83 that have now become the basis of Tona's law, our dearly missed colleague, mentor and friend, Senator Murray Sinclair, shared the following as he explained his support, and I quote, During the hearings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we toured as many of the residential schools that were still standing. In every one of them, there was a small room, usually under a staircase, where the residents would be confined if they were not listening to what the teachers were telling them. In each of those little rooms, some of them only 2 or 3 feet tall, you could see scratch marks on the wall and sometimes even blood stains from where children had tried to claw their way out or leave some kind of evidence of their being there, end quote. This April, I visited this site of the Mush Hole, the Mohawk Institute residential school at Six Nations. Among other sites that I will carry with me for the rest of my life was the under-stair isolation cupboard that Senator Sinclair described. For too many Indigenous children and communities, residential schools were the beginnings of solitary confinement, forced removals, and mass institutionalization, now perpetrated by child welfare and prison systems. Tona's Law will help to support the process of transferring individuals' financial resources and inherent rights of self-determination over criminal justice back to Indigenous communities and nations. Next April will mark the 30th anniversary of Justice Louise Arbour's call for the kind of court oversight of isolation that Tona's Law would finally make a reality. During the Commission of Inquiry into certain events at the Prison for Women in Kingston, Justice Arbour insisted that women she met be unshackled and participate as fully as possible. She demonstrated the legal and moral imperative of ensuring the recognition of humanity and human rights. By so doing, she also underscored the need for court oversight and insistence on application of the rule of law and human rights to prisoners. As Justice Arbour issued her report on what happened to the women in 1994, one woman was still in isolation. Prison authorities insisted that she needed to be fully shackled or chained to a bed or the floor in order to keep staff safe. They created a special slot in a door through which they would remove her shackles when she met with a woman, corrections called the one, quote, idiot stupid enough to meet with her without her being physically restrained, end quote. The woman in isolation was Tona, and the idiot who insisted on meeting with her unrestrained was me. The conditions of segregation to which Tona was subjected helped inform Louise Arbour's findings and recommendations in her report following the Commission of Inquiry into certain events at the Prison for Women in Kingston. More than 30 years later, Tona is still working to end solitary confinement, not for herself, but for too many others who have survived and those who have not. This is a moment when human rights feel precarious. It is also a moment when we feel their importance more than ever. As numerous Indigenous leaders have so eloquently expressed, this is a moment to look to, learn from, work with, and uplift those who have never been able to take these rights for granted and who work constantly to strengthen and protect them. Nelson Mandela, himself a survivor of solitary confinement, reminded us that, quote, no one truly knows a nation until one has been inside its jails, end quote. Tona says she often dreams she is still in SEG. So vivid are her memories. My recollections of her torture, as well as that of so many others, mostly leave me vibrating between rage and despair, and then laser-focused on taking action. Tona is one of too many I have known who have barely survived. Others died, subjected to the state-sanctioned torture of segregation and solitary confinement. Like Ashley Smith, who suffered a homicidal death in a segregation cell in 2007, Tona was driven crazy in prison. Unlike Ashley, she mercifully did not die in segregation in a federal prison, but she did emerge permanently and severely harmed. Tona urged any and all who would listen to please end segregation for everyone, everywhere. Senators listened and introduced Tona's Law. Tona may never see the results of this bill she inspired. If we build up community with robust social, economic, and health systems, we can and we must decolonize, decriminalize, and decarcerate. Ending the use of isolation is just one step in that direction. Honourable colleagues, let's work together to pass Tona's Law and return it to the other place. Let's work in solidarity for a fairer and more just future to which all Canadians can aspire. Miigwech, merci. Thank you.
So Senator Moody, Senatress Clement, and then Senator Deakin. Senator Moody.
Will Senator Pate take a question? Senator Pate, you've often referred to the need to end mass incarceration. of Black Canadians, and including their isolation. Can you expand on how Tona's law fits with the goals of the Black strategy, Black justice strategy, please?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I mean, one of the objectives to end the mass incarceration involves building up community, and in sections 81 and 84 of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, there are already provisions that would allow them to be applied to not just Indigenous prisoners, but to other prisoners, as I mentioned, Black prisoners amongst them. And given that the numbers have been going up, many have described the need to look at, like we do Section 718-2E, or otherwise referred to as GLADU reports, look at the kinds of cultural supports that could be available and develop those kinds of models for Black prisoners.
Supplementary, Senator? Sénatrice Clément.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Senator Clément, thank you, Madam Speaker.
Rage and despair, and then your work. Much appreciated. So I read with horror the media reports this week of 2 former correctional officers taking their own lives after indicating that they had suffered harassment at the Joyceville Federal Institution. It's difficult to imagine that, and if correctional officers are suffering from harassment, it's difficult to imagine as well what incarcerated people are suffering. I wonder, and they've reported to me as well, that incarcerated people do suffer intimidation, abuse. So I'm wondering what you've witnessed and how Tona's law is going to help staff and incarcerated people in that kind of context.
Senator Pate.
Thank you for that question. Yes, I've received many, many calls from folks who worked with the 2 individuals whose stories, whose suicides have been discussed. And one of the things that we weren't able to report in the human rights report was every single prison we visited, there were staff who wanted to meet in camera, who were fearful of the repercussions if it was known that they were meeting with us. And, you know, you've heard some of them at Edmonton Institution, Millhaven. Every place we went, we had private meetings with staff. We couldn't report on that because they have to be public meetings that we use for the evidence. But many staff, and as recently as just last week, staff were calling me and reporting incidents and indicating that if we have some protection for prisoners, it may be that they'll be more likely that staff will also treat each other better. The law itself doesn't require staff to treat each other better. We presume that will be in place. But that's certainly what I'm hearing from individuals who are working in the institutions, that part of it is modeling that behavior. And, you know, as I've said many times, not necessarily in this chamber, but in other public spaces, you can only imagine if that's how staff are treating each other, how they're treating the prisoners.
Sénatrice Clément, supplémentaire? Ça va? Senator
Supplementary question, Senator Clément.
Thank you for your speech, and as someone who's not a big fan of Senate public bills, thank you for your bill for Tona's law. I don't see another path forward for something you've been fighting for a long time, and that I think any of us who are in favor of appropriate, effective, and cost-efficient public policy care about. Just 2 questions. You can answer as briefly or otherwise. What percentage of those who are inmates in our federal penitentiary system eventually get released? My sense is it's 99% or something of that order. But so what we do in there eventually comes out here. Is really what I want to look at. And the other is, from a process management standpoint, how many things have gone wrong in the process by the point that you're having to put somebody in solitary confinement, whether it's named strategic intervention units or solitary confinement, it's solitary confinement. There must be so many points at which a different decision could have been made from a process management standpoint to not end up there. Can you speak a little bit about that as well? Thanks.
Senator Pate.
Thank you. Yeah, the vast majority of prisoners do return to the community, not all, and we probably know and can count on our hands the numbers who will never see the light of day, even though they may, on paper, at some point be eligible for release. And in fact, during the pandemic, Tony Dube, Dr. Dube, who was part of initially the chair and then later one of the members of the disbanded Ministerial Advisory Committee, talked about the fact that in any month there are at least 5,000 prisoners released in Canada. And so when we know those figures and we know that that doesn't result in the types of crime waves that we're often encouraged to think about, we know that many people go on to integrate back into the community. But to your point, the issue of how people end up in isolation, I wish that we could say it's a clear trajectory, but it's not. When we look at the classification scheme, when we look at what kind of supports are in place, when we look at what kind of evidence is put before a court, it can very much determine what the treatment is once someone gets into prison. And someone with mental health issues almost always ends up in segregation, not because of ill-willed staff. Sometimes it is, but that's not the predominant reason. The predominant reason is it's the easiest place to watch people. And so I have many staff who will call and say, can you think of anything else we could be doing right now? And we often can. And in fact, there have been times, at a time just before I joined the Senate, where we were working with the Human Rights Commission on a plan to desegregate all of the institutions where women were housed. We were down to 5 women. And the plan was that the minute they were thinking they needed to isolate someone, there would be a notification, and the Native Women's Association, sometimes the Disability Women's Network, as well as I was with Elizabeth Fry at the time, as well as the Human Rights Commission would intervene to come up with an individualized plan. We know also that when the Ontario government introduced the legislation that has not been enacted yet under the previous provincial government, they actually planned to initially start with at least 4 provincial jails that would have no segregation units, because they knew what they'd learned from the youth system, that is, if you disallow it, then you actually create alternatives. And so I think we don't know the extent of the creativity that is possible if we push for people not to necessarily have this as their first tool that they can utilize. Again, not for nefarious reasons, but because they're truly concerned that people not harm themselves or hurt themselves. And I think you have heard me talk about examples of when guards would say to me, if I had my now adult daughter strapped in a sling, and something was happening in the prison, and they would say, why don't you go down and visit? We hear they really like the baby. Meanwhile, they were contemplating whether they would put all of that group of women in isolation by bringing in an emergency response team, basically a riot squad, to quell them. So even in those instances, if they don't see that they have other options available, it's very difficult to utilize those options. And that was a moment where it became very clear to all of us how little it took to take a different tact sometimes, but how challenging it is when that's not what you're encouraged to do or those aren't the tools available to you.
I will ask for Senator Klein, and I don't think we'll have any time left, but Senator Klein?
Would the Honourable Pate take the next question? As I recall, C-83 was fundamentally in its aims and objective rather sound, and it was the vision that would be conjured up from, if you follow the path, was a necessary improvement on the segregated positions that were there before they introduced the Bill 83. And I do remember in the final round of questioning of expert witnesses, we had the commissioner on there, and it dawned on me that every good plan needs to be executed and implemented and executed as planned, and the resources provided for it. And then you need to continue to follow that up and make sure the culture is going to support that and that the strategy will support it. And to our disappointment when we went to go visit, what we imagined to be happening wasn't happening. We didn't see the resources that were supposed to be applied to it. And it was a culture that was not supporting this, and it was a structure or strategy that wasn't supporting it. And here we are now. Again, there was amendments to 83. There was other amendments, and now we went out another one. This has to lie at the center of the feet of whoever's in charge of that, the commissioner, and making sure that there is those support services there and that they're actually following through the programs. Too many of these people would like to be in the programs, but they're not getting them. And so with this one that you're introducing, how can we make them accountable from the top level down? And what's the penalty there has to be consequences for them not following through on it.
Senator Pate, time allowed for debate has expired. Would you like more time to answer Senator Klein's question? Are you asking for more time? Is it agreed, honourable senators? Is leave granted? Agreed. Senator Pate.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Klein, for that question, and thank you for all the work you did on the bill, but also really importantly afterwards ensuring and monitoring what happened and ensuring that your staff were made available. In fact, your former staff member was in touch with me last night about this very bill. Yes, I mean, one of the challenges, and I think Professor Emeritus Michael Jackson probably put it best when he said, for 50 years I tried to figure out ways to help reform corrections and put in place within corrections policies mechanisms that would encourage the kind of culture change that happened. And in many of our experiences, mine included, sometimes you'll see a champion who will change something for a period of time in any institution, including prisons. But without, part of the reason judicial oversight, Madam Justice Louise Arbour made that recommendation 30 years ago now, was that she recognized it was one of the few ways to force the change to happen. And as lawyers have pointed out, and others will know, when you're, part of what corrections was trying to do was avoid the oversight, avoid the decision being taken by the Supreme Court of Canada that would actually address some of the issues that Tona's law is trying to. But it also is one of the ways, if you have judicial oversight, it's one of the ways to get the record public. Right now, we rely on corrections to produce it. And, I was heartbroken to read the justice who's doing that fatality inquiry, almost 15 years after the young man's death, still can't get documents. And we hear that all the time. I was, in a courtroom last week, and the Crown was asking where I got access to documents that the Crown should have had access to. And so I think this is something that one of the few ways to change it is to insist that we have that judicial oversight and that it goes before the courts, and also to provide potential remedies for those who are wrong.